There is a country in southern Africa whose national flag has a rifle on it. Not a historical musket, not a symbolic sword, a fully automatic assault rifle. An AK-47 with a bayonet attached, printed on the official flag of a sovereign nation, written into that country's constitution, flying above government buildings, schools, and embassies around the world. That country is Mozambique, and the fact that a specific rifle ended up on a national flag tells you almost everything you need to know about what the AK-47 actually is. It's not just a weapon, it's the weapon. The one that outlasted the empire that created it. The one that armed every revolution, every insurgency, and every conflict of the last 70 years. The one you can buy in some parts of the world for less than $50, or trade for a chicken. Over 100 million have been produced. That's more than any other firearm in human history. Half of them were built outside Russia, many with no license at all, by factories and workshops from Eastern Europe to Pakistan to North Korea. And it was designed in a military hospital bed by a wounded tank driver with no engineering degree who just wanted to build something that worked. This is that story. Mikhail Kalashnikov was born in 1919 in the village of Kurya, in the Altai region of Siberia. He was the 17th of 19 children. His parents were peasants. In 1930, when Mikhail was 10 years old, the Soviet state labeled his family kulaks, a designation that meant the government considered them too prosperous, too independent, and therefore enemies of the revolution. Their property was confiscated. The entire family was deported to a remote village in Tomsk Oblast. His father died the same year they arrived. It sounds like the beginning of a story about someone who has everything taken from him and spends his life broken by it. That's not what happened. Forced to supplement farming with hunting, the family relied on firearms for food. The young Mikhail began using his father's rifle in his early teens, not as a hobby, not as sport, but because they needed to eat. He learned firearms the way a carpenter learns wood, as tools with a specific job to do and a specific way to fail. That practical, unsentimental relationship with weapons never left him. In 1938, at 19, he was conscripted into the Red Army. Small, mechanically gifted, and already an experienced tinkerer, he was assigned as a tank mechanic, Bartra, and later promoted to tank commander. He was good enough at inventing that General Georgy Zhukov, one of the most powerful military figures in the Soviet Union, personally awarded him a wristwatch for designing a device that counted shots fired from a tank gun. A wristwatch from Zhukov. For a peasant kid from Siberia with no engineering degree, then Germany invaded. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. Within weeks, Kalashnikov's regiment was in combat. By October, he was commanding a T-34 at the Battle of Bryansk, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire Eastern Front. A German grenade splinter tore into his shoulder. His comrades pulled him from the tank. It took 2 days for a field doctor to reach him because his position had been surrounded by German troops. The evacuation was a desperate breakout through enemy lines in a truck full of wounded men. He spent the next 6 months in a military hospital, and it was there, lying in a recovery ward, shoulder shattered, war still raging outside, that he started listening. The soldiers in the beds around him talked constantly about their weapons, about rifles that jammed in mud, that froze in winter. That couldn't match the firepower of German infantry armed with the MP-40 and the MG-42. The Soviet army was fighting the most mechanized, most heavily armed force in history. And its soldiers felt naked. Kalashnikov had nothing to do but think, so he started designing. He had no formal engineering training, no drafting tools, no access to a workshop. He borrowed a Mosin rifle from hospital staff and disassembled it on his bed, studying how it worked, where it failed, and what a better version would look like. By the time he was discharged in April 1942, he had the beginnings of an idea. Not yet a rifle, not yet the AK-47, but the seed of something that would outlast the Soviet Union, outlast the Cold War, and end up on the flag of a country in southern Africa that didn't exist yet when he was lying in that hospital bed. He just needed somewhere to build it. In 1946, the Soviet Main Artillery Directorate announced a formal competition. Every major Soviet weapons designer was invited to submit a prototype. This was not a small field. Vasily Degtyarev had been designing Soviet weapons since 1916. Georgy Shpagin had created the PPSH-41, the submachine gun that Soviet troops had used throughout the entire war. These were legends of Soviet arms design, with decades of experience, entire factories at their disposal, and teams of trained engineers behind them. Mikhail Kalashnikov was 26 years old. He had no engineering degree. He had no factory. He had a small workshop, one assistant, and a design that he had been reworking obsessively since his hospital discharge. He submitted anyway. The first round of trials in 1946 was brutal. Every design was tested for reliability, accuracy, and ease of maintenance under simulated combat conditions. Degtyarev's rifle, the entry from the most celebrated weapons designer in Soviet history, failed. Shpagин's entry failed. Most of the field was eliminated. 3 designs made it to the final round. Kalashnikov and 2 other designers named Bulkin and Dementiev. And here is where something remarkable happened. Late in 1946, as the prototypes were being evaluated, Kalashnikov's assistant, a man named Alexander Zaitsev, told him the design needed to be fundamentally reworked, not tweaked, redesigned. Kalashnikov was reluctant. Their rifle was already outperforming the competition. Why risk it? Zaitsev convinced him. They rebuilt the rifle almost from scratch, combining the long-stroke gas piston of one design with the receiver layout of another, the safety mechanism borrowed from a Browning, and the trigger group inspired by the American M1 Garand. The result was not a revolutionary invention. It was, as historians have described it, a brilliant synthesis. The best features of existing designs, assembled by someone who understood exactly what a soldier in the field actually needed. In November 1947, the new prototypes were completed. In December, the final report was filed. The commission's verdict, Kalashnikov's design, was the winner. Degtyarev, who had been designing weapons since before Kalashnikov was born, looked at the result and reportedly told his own team there was nothing more to be done. The better rifle had won. There is one more thing worth knowing about the competition. Between 1946 and 1951, a small group of German engineers was working at the Izhevsk factory where the AK would eventually be produced. Among them was Hugo Schmeisser, designer of the STG-44, the German assault rifle that had helped inspire the entire Soviet development program in the first place. For decades, Western analysts argued that Schmeisser must have contributed to the AK-47's design. Soviet officials denied it. The evidence, examined carefully, suggests the Soviets were right. Schmeisser and his team were classified as secret and prohibited from accessing the AK program. The design work was done in Kovrov, where Kalashnikov worked, not in Izhevsk, where the Germans were. But the controversy never quite went away, and honestly, the fact that it exists at all tells you something about how hard it was for the West to accept that a self-taught tank driver from Siberia had built a better rifle than anyone they had. Everyone knows the AK-47 is reliable. You've heard the stories. Dig it out of the mud, knock off the dirt, fire it, leave it in a ditch for 20 years, pull it out. It still works. The unkillable rifle. Most of that is true, but the reason why is more interesting than the legend. The AK-47 was not designed to be the most accurate rifle. It was not designed to be the lightest or the most ergonomic or the most technologically sophisticated. It was designed for one specific type of soldier, a Soviet conscript with weeks of training, no specialist knowledge, and a high probability of fighting in freezing temperatures or dense vegetation. And for that soldier, in that environment, Kalashnikov made one fundamental decision that shaped everything else. Loose tolerances. In precision engineering, tolerances refer to how tightly the components of a mechanism fit together. Tight tolerances mean high accuracy, but they also mean that any contamination, any swelling from heat or cold, any particle of sand or grain of dirt that gets into the action has somewhere to catch and cause a jam. The M16, as we covered in the last video, was built with tight tolerances. It was a precision instrument. Precision instruments require precise maintenance. The AK-47's components fit together with deliberate sloppiness. There is room in the action for grit, coarse carbon fouling, and debris to move around without stopping the mechanism. The bolt carrier travels in a receiver with enough clearance that it keeps cycling even when things get dirty. The gas piston system, a long rod that operates separately from the bolt, keeps the worst of the carbon fouling away from the working parts of the action entirely. The result is a rifle that a poorly trained conscript can abuse for weeks without cleaning in mud and snow and heat, and it will still fire. But here's where the story gets more complicated, and where the myth starts to separate from reality. The AK-47 is not actually good in thick mud. Modern testing has shown repeatedly that when an AK is submerged in heavy, clay-like mud and then fired, it jams. The loose tolerances that make it tolerant of dust and sand also mean that mud has more space to enter the action. The AR-15, because of its tighter, more sealed design, actually outperforms the AK in certain mud tests. The dust cover on the AR seals the action more completely than the AK's receiver cover does. What the AK genuinely excels at is exactly what it was designed for: Arctic cold, dry sand, prolonged neglect, freezing temperatures that would cause a more precisely engineered rifle to seize entirely. The Bakelite magazines were specifically chosen because metal magazines freeze to the receiver in extreme cold. Plastic doesn't. Every design decision was optimized for the Red Army's most likely battlefield, Eastern Europe, in winter. And then there is the question that the previous video about the M16 already answered. If you compare a perfectly maintained M16A1 to a perfectly maintained AK-47, the M16 wins on accuracy, rate of fire control, and terminal performance at range. But in the real world, across the wars of the last 70 years, in the hands of insurgents and guerrillas and conscripts in jungles and deserts who had no cleaning kits, no armorers, and no supply chains, the AK-47's philosophy of designing the weapon around the soldier it would actually have, rather than the soldier you wished you had, proved decisive. Eugene Stoner built a rifle for a professional. Mikhail Kalashnikov built a rifle for everyone else, and there turned out to be a lot more of everyone else. When the AK-47 was adopted by the Soviet Army in 1949, it was classified, completely secret. No foreign government knew it existed. Soviet troops trained with it behind closed doors, and the weapon didn't appear in any official photographs or military publications. That secrecy lasted about 4 years. By 1953, the year Stalin died, the Soviets had made a decision that would shape the next 70 years of global conflict. They weren't going to keep the AK-47 to themselves. They were going to give it to everyone, not sell, give. The blueprint for the AK-47 was shared with every Warsaw Pact nation: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. But the Soviets went further than that. They provided complete manufacturing packages, including machinery, technical expertise, and raw materials, to developing nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Any country that aligned itself with Moscow, or that the Soviets wanted to pull into their orbit, received not just rifles, but the ability to build rifles. Unlimited, forever, without paying royalties, without asking permission. This was not generosity, it was strategy. The rifle was the physical manifestation of Soviet foreign policy. Every communist insurgency, every anti-colonial movement, every government that Moscow wanted to bring into its sphere of influence received AK-47s. Any country that supported communist ideals was given the AK-47 without charge in mass quantities. The AK-47 came to represent the manifestation of communism, a threat to democracy in Western eyes. The numbers cascaded outward at a scale that had never been seen with any weapon in history. By 1956, China had its own production line, meaning the two largest militaries on Earth were simultaneously building the same rifle. By 1958, the blueprint had reached North Korea and Egypt. Soon came the rolling openings of assault rifle assembly lines in the Warsaw Pact. The Kremlin had ensured production of the Kalashnikov at a scale no other firearm had ever seen, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, the USSR ceased to exist. Its military dissolved. Its Warsaw Pact allies, suddenly impoverished, suddenly desperate for hard currency, had one thing of value: warehouses full of weapons. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, former Warsaw Pact nations were extremely poor and had one chief export: arms and armor from the Cold War. AK-47s flooded out of Eastern Europe and into every conflict zone on Earth. In some parts of Africa in the 1990s, you could buy one for less than the price of a live chicken. Here's perhaps the most extraordinary detail of the entire story. In the years following the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the United States military, the same military that had spent 50 years fighting the AK-47 in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in every proxy war of the Cold War, began purchasing AK-47s, not capturing them, buying them, from Eastern European surplus stockpiles, to arm the new Iraqi security forces, because the Iraqi soldiers already knew how to use the AK, and retraining them on the M16 would take too long. The rifle designed in a Soviet hospital bed to defeat American weapons had become a weapon the Americans themselves were buying. Mikhail Kalashnikov had nothing to do with any of this. He had designed a tool. The tool had escaped its makers and become something no one had planned for. Not a weapon, but a currency. Exchangeable for influence, for loyalty, for the ability to fight a war that someone else was paying for. No patent, no license fee, no way to put it back. It was already everywhere. For the first 4 years of its existence, the AK-47 was a ghost. The Soviet Union had done something remarkable. They had armed an entire military with a revolutionary new weapon and kept it completely secret from the West. No photographs, no defectors with details, no intelligence reports, nothing. The first crack came in April 1953. A CIA field operative in the Leningrad region spotted something unusual during a Soviet military demining operation. Soldiers of the Krasnoselsky Guards Regiment were carrying a weapon he didn't recognize. He couldn't get close enough to examine it, so he did the only thing he could. He memorized it, walked away, and drew it from memory. That sketch, a crude pencil drawing of a rifle with a curved magazine, a pistol grip, and a distinctive front sight, landed on CIA desks in Washington as the first Western intelligence on the AK-47. The report described the weapon as a new gas-operated submachine gun. They didn't even know what category of weapon they were looking at. That misidentification would persist for over a decade. When a fuller CIA report arrived in 1955, the weapon was still being called a submachine gun. When the AK appeared in the hands of Soviet troops crushing the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the first time Western photographers captured it on film, the analysis was still uncertain. It wasn't until November 1965, at the Battle of Ia Drang in Vietnam, that the US military officially stopped calling AK rifles submachine guns. 12 years. The most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world spent 12 years miscategorizing a weapon that was already in the hands of millions of soldiers. When the US military finally got its hands on an actual AK-47, sometime in 1960 or 1961, through channels that remain partially classified, the reaction was revealing. The prevailing attitude among Army ordnance officers was dismissive. The rifle was crude. The tolerances were sloppy. It wasn't competitive with the M14 or the emerging AR-15. American engineers had been trained to value precision. The AK's deliberate looseness looked like a flaw, not a feature. Vietnam corrected that assessment violently. American troops in the jungle quickly learned what the data hadn't told them. The AK-47 in the hands of a Viet Cong fighter who had been living in the jungle for months, with no cleaning kit and no armor, worked. Their M16S, as we covered in the previous video, frequently didn't. The psychological impact was significant. Some soldiers began collecting AK-47s from dead enemy fighters, not as trophies but as backup weapons. The US response was complex and contradictory. On one hand, the Pentagon invested billions in developing better American rifles. The program that eventually fixed the M16 and produced the M16A1. On the other hand, the CIA began acquiring and distributing AK-47s itself. During the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, the CIA funneled billions of dollars of weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen, and the weapon of choice was the AK-47, purchased from Egypt, China, and Eastern Europe. The logic was simple. Afghan fighters already knew how to use it, ammunition was abundant, and if weapons were captured by the Soviets, they couldn't be traced back to American supply chains. The CIA was buying the Soviet rifle, with American taxpayer money, to fight the Soviets. One of those Afghan fighters, armed in part by CIA-supplied AK-47s, was a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Today, in the private museum at CIA headquarters in Langley, a museum the public will never see, there is a glass display case. Inside it, on a simple brass plaque, are the words, Osama bin Laden's AK-47. Recovered from the third floor of the Abbottabad compound on the night of May 2, 2011. A Russian-made rifle with counterfeit Chinese markings, kept by the agency that had, 30 years earlier, helped put weapons just like it into the hands of the Afghan resistance. The AK-47's journey through American foreign policy is a story with no clean ending. Every attempt to contain it, counter it, or co-opt it spread it further. The rifle had escaped its makers. Now it was escaping its enemies, too. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The empire that had created the AK-47, that had built it into a symbol of communist ideology and distributed it to every corner of the world, ceased to exist. The AK-47 didn't notice. It had already escaped. It was in warehouses in Poland and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania. It was in the jungles of Angola and Mozambique. It was in the hands of cartels in Colombia and militias in Lebanon and warlords in Afghanistan. It was being manufactured without a license in workshops in Pakistan's tribal areas. Assembled from parts by hand, without machinery, without the Izhevsk factory, without the Soviet Union, without anyone's permission. Some 200 different types of Kalashnikovs are now produced in at least 30 countries, and vast quantities of the weapons have turned up in trouble spots worldwide for decades, especially in Africa. The number of Kalashnikov rifles in circulation worldwide is estimated at somewhere between 100 and 200 million. That's one for every 35 to 70 people on Earth. The price tells the story better than anything else. In the United States, a legal semi-automatic AK variant costs around $700 to $1,000 in a gun shop. In Iraq, in the years following the 2003 invasion, flooded with surplus weapons from collapsed government stockpiles, you could buy one for $50. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa in the 1990s, the price dropped below $10. In some documented cases, an AK-47 was traded for a bag of grain or a live chicken. A weapon that requires no maintenance contract, no spare parts supply chain, no factory support, no army behind it, just ammunition, which is also everywhere because 100 million rifles create their own ammunition ecosystem. And here's the problem that no government, no treaty, and no arms control organization has been able to solve. The AK-47's early advantage was that as a Soviet invention, it was not subject to patent and so could be freely copied. Furthermore, large caches of these weapons were freely distributed to regimes and rebels sympathetic to the Soviet Union, giving the AK-47 a foothold advantage. That foothold is now permanent. The weapons already exist. They are durable enough to last 50 years with minimal maintenance. They pass from conflict to conflict, from country to country, from generation to generation. The AK-47 used in the 2015 Paris attacks at the Bataclan Theater had been traced back to a Balkan surplus stockpile, a rifle built during the Cold War, stored in a warehouse for decades, sold through a chain of intermediaries, and used in a terrorist attack in Western Europe in the 21st century. One rifle, 40 years, 3 continents. Mikhail Kalashnikov died on December 23, 2013, at the age of 94. In the last months of his life, he wrote a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. In it, he asked whether he bore moral responsibility for the deaths caused by his weapon. The Patriarch's response was that the designer bore no responsibility, that the weapon was created to defend the motherland, and that its misuse by others was not his sin. Whether Kalashnikov found that comforting, nobody knows. What is known is that he spent the last years of his life troubled by a question he could never fully answer. He had designed a tool. The tool had become something he never intended and could not control. That is the real story of the AK-47, not the rifle, not the design, not even the Soviet Union. It's the story of what happens when you build something so simple, so cheap, and so effective that the world will never stop making it, long after the man who invented it and the empire that built it are gone. So let's come back to where we started. A rifle on a national flag. 100 million copies in circulation. A weapon that outlasted the empire that created it. The ideology it was built to spread, and the man who designed it in a hospital bed with a shattered shoulder and no engineering degree. Mikhail Kalashnikov didn't set out to change the world. He set out to build something that worked, something simpler, tougher, and more forgiving than anything that existed. He succeeded so completely that the world never stopped copying him. That's the thing about truly simple ideas. You can't uninvent them. You can't recall them. You can't negotiate them away. The AK-47 exists in a quantity and a distribution that puts it permanently beyond the control of any government, any treaty, or any arms embargo. It will be firing in conflicts that haven't started yet, in countries that don't exist yet, long after everyone alive today is gone. Whether that's a testament to Kalashnikov's genius or a tragedy, probably depends on which end of it you're on. If this changed how you think about the AK-47 or about the weapons we build and lose control of, let me know in the comments. And if you haven't seen the M16 video yet, the story of the rifle on the other side of this one, it's on the channel. The 2 videos tell the same story from opposite directions. Subscribe if you want more. Black tapes. We find what's left on the tape.